You can pre-order Modern Horizons 3 using my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm bringing you my Modern Horizons 3 Archetype Guide. Over the last several days, I've evaluated every card in the set in my set review. Today we're going to continue to look at Limited, but we're going to focus on what each color combination is trying to do in the format when it comes to synergy. This is not a video where I'm going to talk about the best cards in the set and things like that. Instead, I'll be focusing on cards that are particularly well suited to each color pair. If you want to hear me talk about the cards in the set more broadly, that's what the set review is for. Alright, without further ado, let's take a look at each color pair in Modern Horizons 3, starting with Blue-Green, which is one of the Eldrazi decks. There are 3 broad categories that 8 of the 10 archetypes in this format fit into. One of them is Eldrazi, one of them is Energy, and one of them is Modifications. And we're starting with those Eldrazi decks, of which there are 2, and we're looking at the Blue-Green one, which is the most focused on ramp. As usual, every color pair in the set has a Signpost uncommon, but there's also a Signpost common, and in some cases, there's more than one Signpost uncommon, and this blue-green deck is one of those cases. So you've got a card like Planar Genesis, which helps you ramp your mana as one of your Signpost uncommons. You've got Drowner of Truth as the modal double-faced land for blue-green, which is a big ol' Eldrazi you can ramp into, who also makes some Eldrazi spawns. You've got Snapping Voidcraw as your Signpost common, which can tap for 2 colorless mana, and you can sink mana into it to draw cards. And the last of these is Wastescape Battle Mage, a card that has Kicker in both green and blue. Obviously, all 4 of these are by far at their best in this particular deck, where your whole game plan is to get lots of mana in play and play the big ol' Eldrazi in the format. So what do we have apart from all those cards we just looked at? Well, you've got a card like Nightshade Dryad, which can tap for not only mana of any color, but also colorless. And that matters because, of course, there are cards in this set that require colorless mana specifically. This is also the best deck for Path of Annihilation. It makes 2 Eldrazi spawn, which of course can be sacrificed for mana, but it also lets all of your Eldrazi tap for mana of any color. And then when you cast a big ol' creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, you get to gain 4 life. So this is a card that will really ramp your mana up, and then also help you stay alive after having done so, because it gains you life when you finally play a big Eldrazi. You've got Wumpus Aberration. It might be a little more at home in the red-green deck, but this is a deck that can easily pay colorless for it and get this big creature ahead of schedule. You've also got Basking Broodscale, which can spit out Eldrazi spawn, which help you ramp. You've got Eldrazi Repurposer, which makes one of those spawns when it enters and one when it dies. You've got Malevolent Rumble, a card selection spell that lets you put a spawn into play. This is also a really great deck for Kozilek's Unsealing, which makes 2/0/1 spawns anytime you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, and then when you cast one of those real big spells with mana value 7 or greater, it draws you 3 cards. Sage of the Unknowable can be tapped for colorless mana, but only for colorless spells or to activate an ability. Obviously, a lot of the spells in this deck are colorless. Drownyard Lurker and Warped Tusker, they're not quite Signpost commons, but they are a pair that also shows you what blue-green's about, because they're both big ol' things you can ramp into, and early you can cycle them away and get Eldrazi spawn. Among the other kinds of things you can be ramping into are Breaker of Creation, an 8/4 with hexproof from each color, and Annihilator 2, and it also gains you 1 life for each colorless permanent you control, which includes all your lands and all of your Devoid things and other colorless stuff you have in play, and all your Eldrazi spawn. You've got It That Heralds the End, which makes your big expensive spells cheaper and also buffs all your colorless creatures. What rares fit in well here? Well, you've got Fanatic of Ronus, which is good at pumping your mana up, and if you have a big creature in play, can produce even more mana. You've got Flare of Cultivation, which gets you a couple of lands. You've got Sowing Mycospawn, an Eldrazi that grabs you a land from your deck. You've got Ugin's Binding, which is sort of a weak bounce spell early, but if it's ever in your graveyard and you cast a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater, it's basically Cyclonic Rift, and obviously this deck's going to be good at making that happen. You've got Devourer of Destiny, an expensive Eldrazi that requires 2 colorless mana, but it exiles a permanent when it enters the battlefield, also gives you some card selection at the beginning of the game. This is also the best deck for casting all of the Eldrazi Titans, because this is the deck the best at making mana in the whole set. And Kozilek is sort of the most realistic one to cast, because he's only costs 9. He also has an ability that will immediately buff a bunch of your board in addition to the manifest stuff. You've got Null Drifter, which is another good thing to ramp into, draws you a couple cards. You can also evoke it early. You've got Kozilek's Command, which is, again, a nice place to sink all of the mana that you can produce in this deck. You're also going to have an easy time getting to colorless. So that's blue-green. It's about ramping in particular. Red-green is a little bit different. It also can ramp pretty well because it has access to a lot of the same stuff. But when you look at the two signpost cards here, you've got Writhing Chrysalis, which makes 2 Eldrazi spawn and grows when you sack Eldrazi spawn. And you've got Titan's Vanguard, which when you cast it and when it attacks, puts a +1/+1 counter on each of your colorless creatures. So this deck can ramp using Eldrazi spawn and stuff like blue-green, but it's also interested in using the Eldrazi spawn for other purposes, whether it's to grow Writhing Chrysalis, or whether it's to go wide with them so that your Titan's Vanguard is just buffing a whole bunch of 0/1s. You've got cards here. Once again, we have Wumpus Aberration. The reason I say this one might just be a little bit better here is because this deck is less into ramping and is more willing to give up a spawn early to get out an Aberration, whereas the other deck kind of wants to stockpile them until it can play something big. Basking Brood Scale is another card that we've already seen. It makes spawns. We already saw the Repurposer too. It makes spawns. We've seen the Rumble as well. But after that, we get to cards like Glimpse the Impossible, which is a draw spell, but also one that can give you 3 Eldrazi spawns, potentially. You've also got Skittering Precursor, who likes it when you sack non-token permanents, giving you a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn when you do it. You've got Spawn Gang Commander, which makes 3 Eldrazi spawns, but can also sack Eldrazi to do 2 damage to things. Propagator Drone, which gives all of your creature tokens evolve, which is pretty great when you're talking about 0/1s in an Eldrazi deck, because you're just going to keep playing big things that grow all your spawns. It can also spit out spawns, which is nice. Eldrazi Ravager, which can come back from your graveyard to your hand if you sacrifice 2 Eldrazi, which spawn are what you're going to want to be sacrificing. Glaring Fleshraker gives you an Eldrazi spawn every time you cast a colorless spell, and whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if you're making a bunch of those spawns, they're going to be pinging your opponent a bunch, and obviously it makes them on its own as well. And It That Heralds the End in this deck, it seems like the more valuable part is the other colorless creatures you control get +1/+1, because you're better at going wide with spawn, but obviously the fact that you've also got this mode where, you know, it decreases the cost of your expensive stuff is good too. Rares that work well here, well, we've got Eldrazi Linebreaker, an aggressive Eldrazi that gets better the more Eldrazi you control, and obviously if you're making spawns, you're going to control them. Kozilek's Command. In this deck, maybe you're going to use the mode that makes spawn more often. And you've also got Harrogast Erupting Nullkite. I have it here because it has a merge for red. While the blue-green deck might be able to ramp into it by getting to 9 mana, this deck can get it down a lot earlier. You know, sacrificing something that already gave you some spawns or something like that for value so that you can play Harrogast earlier. So those are the two most Eldrazi-centric decks, blue-green and red-green. They both are going to be pretty good at playing big Eldrazi, but the blue-green deck is going to be better at ramping, and the red-green deck is going to be more about going wide with Eldrazi spawn. So now we're going to move into the Adapt decks, starting with the black-green one, which is, in particular, more about Adapt and +1/+1 counters than the other two are. You can see that from the 3 signposts we have here. You've got Cursed Wombat, which has Adapt, and also adds additional counters to things when they would get them, which includes itself. You've also got Expanding Ooze, which has Adapt, and when it attacks, you can put a counter on a modified creature you control. And then the Dual Land, Modal Double-Face Dual Land here, puts a counter on something. So this one's the most about +1/+1 counters of the 3 Adapt decks, and Adapt is the biggest feature, the biggest mechanic within it. So again, we've got some payoffs like the Wombat and the Ooze, who are both great because they not only are enablers, they're payoffs. Dream Drinker Vampire has Adapt, and whenever 1 or more counters are put on it, it gains menace until end of turn. And this is what a lot of these Adapt cards say. They give you some sort of effect when you put a counter on them, which includes from their own ability, but remember, you can only adapt when it already doesn't have counters. But if you put counters on them in any other way, they trigger again. And you see the same sort of thing with Fetid Gargantua, which draws you 2 cards and you lose 2 life every time you put a counter on it. Lethal Throwdown is a Bone Splinters. It gets a little bit better if you have modified creatures, because if you sack 1 to it, you get to draw a card. We've got the Root Wallet, which we've already seen a couple of times, and it's here more because of Adapt than it is because of Eldrazi Spawn, but its +1/+1 counter trigger spits out one of those Eldrazi Spawn. Evolution Witness does the Eternal Witness thing every time counters are put on it, including from its own ability. Fangs of Colonia, this is the best deck for it because you're going to have the most counters. Hydra Trainer is a card with Adapt. It doesn't have an Adapt trigger like the others we've seen, but when it attacks, you can exert it, and when you do, you get +X on target creature, where X is the number of total counters on permanents you control. So this is a great deck for it because we've already seen a bunch of commons and uncommons that can put counters on themselves or put counters on things. You've got Lion Umbra, which is probably better than the green-white deck, which cares more about auras, but it does work here because obviously a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it is modified, and this does offer a nice boost. Signature Slam is a bite effect that gets better the more modified creatures you have. Temperamental Oozewag gives your modified creatures trample, and it comes with Adapt. There are a couple of rares that are well suited to this deck. You've got Branching Evolution, which doubles the number of +1/+1 counters that are put on things, and Emperor of Bones, who's one of these Adapt creatures that also has a trigger anytime you put a +1/+1 counter on it. In his case, you get to temporarily bring back a hasty creature from the graveyard. All right, let's move to green-white now, which is also a modified deck, but it's more into auras and equipment. You have a signpost uncommon in the form of Golden Tail Trainer, which reduces the cost of auras and equipment by X, where X is its power. So he both lowers the cost of those things and also gets better the more you enhance him. And when he attacks, other modified creatures you control get buffed, where X is Golden Tail Trainer's power. Faithful Watchdog is kind of a weird outlier because it doesn't do anything with auras. It's actually a +1/+1 counter card, but it will still trigger the various modified things. Strength of the Harvest, meanwhile, gives +1/+1 for each creature and or enchantment you control. So, what are the payoffs we have here? Well, we've got Lion Umbra again. You've also got all the cards with Bestow. Almost all the cards in the set with Bestow are green or white, and they're going to be pretty nice here because they can be used to modify creatures thanks to their ability to become auras, but you can also play them as creatures who can then become modified. And Nyxborn Hydra is special in that it will enter modified itself because it comes into play with counters. But it's sort of a stand-in for all of the cards that are Bestow. You've also got Guardian of the Forgotten, who likes it when a modified creature dies. You get to manifest a top card of your library. And Rose-Caught Knight, a creature that when it enters the battlefield, you can reveal an artifact or enchantment card from among your top 6 and put it into your hand. This is going to be the deck that likes equipment and auras the most, so that will work out pretty well. You can also choose to put a counter on it, which will of course make it modified. Envoy of the Ancestors gains counters, and it also gives all your modified creatures lifelink. Rares that work well in this deck include Springheart Nantuko, which has Bestow itself, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and it has a really powerful landfall trigger that lets you double creatures. And there's Pearl Ear Imperial Advisor, which reduces the cost of your enchantment spells. And if you cast an aura that targets a modified permanent you control, you draw a card. It's also a 3/4 lifelink, so a great creature to modify. And the last of these modified decks is the black-white one. It's about modified creatures dying, and of the 3 of these, this is the one that worries me the most. I think most of the time this deck will still be a modification deck, but it's going to be less interested in things dying than they want it to be, or at least I hope that's true, because the other 2 decks just want creatures to be modified. That's easy enough, right? This deck wants them to be modified, and then it wants them to die, which is asking kind of a lot. And On Do Not Master shows you that here. It's a creature on the main side, and whenever another modified creature dies, you get to put 2 counters on it, and it's got lifelink, so it becomes a big threat quickly. It can also put +1/+1 counters on things with its adventure side. Obstinate Gargoyle is the kind of creature that you can sacrifice, which is something this deck is going to want to do to get value out of its dead modified creatures. And then it comes back with Persist, and when it does, it comes back modified. A -1/-1 counter counts. And then Glasswing Grace is the dual land here. And, you know, obviously it offers a modification itself. There's also not that much supporting this theme. You've got the Guardian of Forgotten that we've already seen, and Lethal Throwdown, which we've already seen. So all 3 of these decks, because they're about modify, sometimes you'll be able to play all 3 colors together because you're splashing 1 color. They are all very similar thematically, even if they have different focus, where black-white is more about the creatures dying, green-white is more about auras and equipments to a lesser extent, and black-green is more about +1/+1 counters, but they all care about things being modified, so there's a lot of overlap here, and obviously you can play various black and white cards that I talked about with the other decks in this deck, and I think that's probably the best way black-white's going to work. I don't think you're supposed to go all in on making your modified things die, just because it sounds like a really bad plan. But you do have cards that pay you off for having modified things from the other colors, too. All right, let's move into the energy decks now. The first of these is the most straightforward. It's red-white, so of course that means it's an aggro deck. Your signpost uncommon here is Scurry of Gremlins, which when it enters the battlefield makes 2 gremlin tokens, and then you get an amount of energy equal to the number of creatures you control. So it wants you to go wide specifically, and it helps you do it, and then you can cash in 4 energy to give your whole board +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. If things are going right in this deck, you're going to play Scurry of Gremlins, and you're going to be able to give your whole board +1/+0 and haste all in the same turn, which is going to be a big turn. Conduit Goblin, meanwhile, enters, gives you a couple of energy, and then you can spend energy at the beginning of your combat to give another target creature +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. So these 2 cards are very much aggressive. They use energy specifically to make your creatures into better attackers, and that's kind of the big theme within Red-White in terms of how it uses energy. So you've got payoffs like Scurry of Gremlins and Conduit Goblin. You've got a great 2-drop like Amped Raptor, which, while it doesn't use energy to make itself or something else into a better attacker, it's a super aggressive stat line, and it can help you draw cards effectively using energy. Smelted Charge Bug can give things +1/+0 and menace until end of turn using energy. Thriving Skyclaw can buff itself using energy. Inventor's Axe isn't a card that I love, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one because it's effectively a combat trick, one that gives you energy and one that uses energy to be equipped. Hexgold Slith can buff itself by giving itself first strike when it attacks using energy. Inspired Inventor can give you energy, but can also help you go wide by making a servo or buff a creature. Solstice Zealot is a card that can get problematic blockers out of the way using energy. This might be the best deck for Static Prison, because the big problem with Static Prison is that if you run out of energy, it has an expiration date. First of all, this deck's good at producing energy, but this is supposed to be a deck that's so aggressive that removing your opponent's best creature, even if it's only for 2 turns, might do enough to win you the game. So Static Prison looks like a nice fit here. You've got Volt Storm Angel, which can use its energy to buff the whole board or give itself Vigilance and Lifelink. The rares you have here include Ether Revolt, a card that does damage to your opponent or any target, actually, anytime you gain energy. You've got Guide of Souls, which gains energy when creatures enter the battlefield, which is what this deck really wants to do, and then can cash in that energy to make something into a big threat. And then you've got a Sweeper that uses energy in Wrath of the Skies. So that's Red-White, uses energy to be aggressive. Next up, we've got Blue-White, which is supposed to be, according to Wizards of the Coast, sort of an energy skies deck. But to me, it feels more like a blue-white mid-range deck than it does a Skies deck, because there's actually not that much in terms of flyers and energy going on, and you can already see that just looking at this particular slide. Emissary of Soulfire doesn't have flying, doesn't give things flying, but it does make energy, and you can put Exalted counters on things using that energy. And it is true that Exalted is good on flyers, because there are lots of board states where you're only attacking with one thing, and it's a flyer. Riddlegate Gargoyle is a flyer, one that can use energy, in its case, to give something lifelink. And then you've got Suppression Ray as the dual land here. It can tap things down, and then you can cash in the energy to stun creatures. So, I mean, I do think it is a Skies deck to an extent, because Blue-White always ends up with a lot of flyers. And a lot of the effects that Blue-White has are things that can make, like, one attacker better, or get blockers out of the way. And oftentimes, if you're getting like one blocker out of the way, that's enough for your flyers to go crazy, because you're getting a reach creature or an opposing flyer out of the way. So what do we have here? Well, we've already seen Volt Storm Angel, which is a great energy flyer. Solstice Zealot, another card that can get blockers out of the way. Another energy flyer we have is Electrozoa, which is a pretty efficient flyer. It has to use energy to keep itself from getting tapped. Bespoke Battle Wagon can also tap creatures, so the idea there being you can get your flyers in a little more easily. Royal Cartographer can make a bunch of energy with landfall and cash it in to draw cards. And Tempest Harvester can loot using energy. So you can see the Skies thing is probably a bit overblown. This is definitely like an energy mid-range deck, energy tempo deck more than anything, as opposed to a deck that's really all about flyers that use energy. Rares at work here, we've already seen both of them, although Guide of Souls is going to be a little better in a deck like this one, because you're going to really like flyers, and Wrath of the Skies is probably a little better here too than it is in an aggressive deck, just because, you know, it's a sweeper. And the last of these energy decks is Blue-Red. I like this one. I like the way this one looks a lot. I hope it actually works out, because unlike the other two, it's more about assembling like engines and using energy for value in ways other than attacking or trying to damage your opponent in a traditional way. You can see that with the Signpost uncommon, Is It Generatorium, which increases the amount of energy you make and can draw you cards, but only if you've paid or lost 4 or more energy this turn. I'm a little skeptical about how well it can work, but I really want it to, because obviously if you're making enough energy to trigger this, you know, I don't know, 2/3 of the time, you're going to be ecstatic. Cyclops Superconductor gives you energy when it enters, and when it dies, you can pay energy, and it does damage equal to its power to any target. And Rush of Inspiration is the dual land here. It's a draw spell that gets better if you have energy to spend. So, what other value things can you do with energy? Well, you can play a card like Ether Spike, which is a counterspell that gets better the more energy you have. I think Bespoke Battle Wagon's probably better here than Blue-White because it has the real potential to be an engine, because it can generate energy, it can tap creatures like we said earlier, but it can also draw you cards, which this deck is interested in. This is also, I think, a better deck for a Royal Cartographer because you're more likely to have the time to get to 6 energy to draw 3 cards, and you're more likely to be able to take advantage of looting in this deck too with Tempest Harvester. Other engines you have include Phyrexian Ironworks, which can spit out 3/3 Phyrexian Golems, and Unstable Amulet, which can effectively draw you cards using energy. A couple of rares here. We've got Aether Revolt again. If there's any deck for Wheel of Potential, it's this one, partly because you're going to be really good at having a ton of energy in this deck, and partly because you're more likely to make the game go long enough that a wheel effect is sort of appealing. So those are the 3 energy decks. You've got sort of a value engine energy deck in the form of Blue-Red. You've got kind of a mid-range tempo Skies energy deck in Blue-White, and you've got a very straightforward Red-White aggro deck that uses energy as well. So we've looked at sort of the 3 main themes that cover 8 of the color pairs, but there are 2 other decks in the format that are kind of off doing their own thing. One of these is Black-Red, which is an artifact deck. Your Signpost uncommon here is Pyretic Rebirth, which lets you return an artifact or creature from your graveyard to your hand and does damage equal to that card's mana value to a creature or planeswalker. That's really good value, and this deck does have a lot of artifacts to get back with it, but it is nice. It can also get creatures, and Cranial Ram is basically cranial plating with legs, gives a big buff based on the number of artifacts you control. Artifact payoffs you have, including Pyretic Rebirth and Cranial Ram. You've also got Frogmere Enforcer, a card that has affinity for artifacts. I'm a little skeptical how easy it will be to make this cheap enough, quickly enough, because while there are lots of artifacts in this set, there aren't so many that you're like dropping Frogmere Enforcer as a 4/4 on turn 3 or anything. I'm more interested in Furnace Hellkite because it's good all game long as a 5/5 flyer with fire breathing and affinity for artifacts. Arcbound Condor looks pretty insane because it's a 4-mana 3/3 flyer with modular 3. That's already a pretty good artifact payoff because it means you can put its counters on something else when it dies. But then when you have artifacts enter the battlefield, you can give a creature an opponent controls -1/-1 until end of turn, and this deck's going to have a lot of artifacts, so that ability is going to be good. You've got Dreadmobile, which is an artifact, but it can also sack artifacts for value. You've got Ethereum Terramander, whose adaptability becomes cheaper the more artifacts you have. You've got Marionette Apprentice, who likes it when creatures or artifacts are put into the graveyard from the battlefield, and it has Fabricate, so it can make an artifact itself. And you've got a 2/1 flyer with affinity for artifacts that makes your opponent discard in the form of Refurbished Familiar. Rares that fit in well here, well, you've got Imskir Iron Eater, who has affinity for artifacts, draws you more cards based on the number of artifacts you control, and has a sacrifice and artifact activated ability that can do damage to any target, so he's all about the artifacts. Crabomination is a huge bomb in any deck, but you're going to be able to emerge from Artifact in Black-Red, so you're going to be able to get it down even sooner, which will make its enter the battlefield ability even stronger because the random discard can just be devastating, and the earlier you get that down, the better. It's just going to give you a ton of value. Shilgengar, also a bomb in pretty much any deck, but this deck can get the most value out of the blood tokens he can generate, so I have it here. And Warren Soul Trader is a card that can generate treasure, and obviously enough, that's a type of artifact. So that's Black-Red. It's an artifact deck, seemingly off on its own, doing its own thing, but I do think there is enough support for artifact stuff in the set for it to be a legit archetype. And then our last of these decks, the last color pair we have left, is Blue-Black. It is a card draw deck. It's a control deck that does various things with card draw to generate value. You've got Horrid Shadow Spinner as your Signpost uncommon. When it attacks, you draw cards equal to its power, and if you do, you discard that many cards. So draw 2, discard 2 every time it attacks is just pretty strong, and it can be even better if you put counters on it or whatever. And Sneaky Snacker has an effect that a bunch of cards in this set do, and that is that it gives you a bonus if you draw your second, or in this case, third card in a turn. In this case, Sneaky Snacker comes back from the graveyard. So you can potentially discard Sneaky Snacker early to your Shadow Spinner, then attack with the Shadow Spinner next turn and get back Sneaky Snacker, for example, which is pretty cool. Other card draw things that pay you off for drawing cards include Deem Inferior, which is a bounce spell that costs 1 less for each card you've drawn this turn. Emrakul's Messenger, which spits out a 0/1 spawn when you draw your second card each turn. Kami of Jealous Thirst, which has an activated ability that becomes free if you've drawn 3 or more cards in a turn. And Mindless Conscription, which when it enters, amasses Zombies 3, but it also does it anytime you draw your third card in a turn. Rares that fit well here, well, you've got Psychic Frog, which is a card that likes it when you have cards in your hand, and a card that draws you cards. You've got Tamio, Inquisitive Student, a 1-mana 0/3 that can generate clues, which are good for triggering your multi-draw stuff, but also she likes it when you draw your third card in a turn because she turns into a Planeswalker. And if there's a deck for Necrodominance, it might be this one just because it can easily trigger all of those if you've drawn so many cards this turn a thing happens. The downside is you're in a control deck and maybe you don't really want to pay life, but this might be the spot for Necrodominance. All right, so those are the 10 color pairs in Modern Horizons 3. This concludes my initial look at this brand new limited format, but there's lots more content about this limited format on the way. I'll be playing in the early access event later this week, getting some draft videos up as soon as I can, and I'll also be talking about this format on my weekly vlog series every Saturday called Nitsa Notes, where I talk about the latest limited format. So if you want to make sure to catch all that content I just mentioned, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. And if you want to pre-order some Modern Horizons 3, check out the Card Kingdom link in the description. Thanks for watching.